Emily West sat in her small kitchen, the soft sunlight filtering through the window, casting a warm glow on the old wooden table. In front of her was a stack of unpaid bills, and all she had left was $2,000. $2,000, after a long drought had nearly destroyed her small ranch in Texas. The fields of grass she depended on had withered, and 3 of her horses had been sold to cover expenses. She had 5 horses left, but without hay to feed them, they would soon meet the same fate as the ones she had to sell. Emily hadn't taken a paycheck from her job in months. She glanced at the photo of her late father, the man who had built this ranch from nothing. The photo always gave her strength on the hardest days. "I can't let it end like this," Emily whispered, her fingers tightly gripping the bills in her hand. She drove her old truck to the small diner in town. Though she couldn't afford to eat out, Maggie, the diner owner, often gave her yesterday's muffins along with her coffee. Today, it wasn't about money. Emily just needed someone to talk to. "Good morning, Emily. Same coffee today?" Maggie asked with a smile as Emily walked in. "Just coffee," Emily replied, her voice heavy and tired. The door opened, and a man walked in. He wore a worn military cap, his shoulders hunched, and his face filled with worry. He sat 2 seats away from Emily at the counter, his hands trembling as if carrying an enormous burden. "Black coffee," he said quietly to Maggie. Maggie poured the coffee, and Emily couldn't help but notice the 1,000-yard stare in his eyes. The same look she had seen many times before in the eyes of soldiers returning from war. She could tell he carried pain that she couldn't fully understand, but she knew it was deep. "How's the job search going, Ethan?" Maggie asked. "Not great," Ethan replied. "I was turned down at the warehouse yesterday. They said my leg would be a liability." Emily noticed him shifting his weight to his left leg, avoiding putting any weight on his right leg. She didn't ask more, but her gaze conveyed deep understanding. "What about the house?" Maggie asked softly. "We got the eviction notice yesterday. 3 days to come up with $22,000, or we're out." Emily's coffee cup paused midway to her lips, her hand trembling with empathy. He wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about losing everything, his family, his home, and everything he had. "I never thought coming home would be harder than being over there," Ethan said, his voice heavy with emotion. Emily looked at him, and suddenly, her own struggles seemed so small in comparison. She had no family to worry about, just the animals, and she could find homes for them if needed. "You served?" Emily asked gently. Ethan nodded. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. "My cousin served in Afghanistan, 10th Mountain Division," Emily said. Ethan's face softened. "Good unit." Emily took a deep breath. The money in her pocket was meant for hay, but without it, the remaining horses would go hungry. Her father's legacy would crumble even faster. But this man had served his country. He had a family. And a sick child. "I think I might be able to help," Emily said quietly. Ethan looked at her, confused. "Help how?" Emily pulled out an envelope from her pocket and placed it on the counter between them. "I have $2,000 here. It was meant for feed for my horses, but your family needs it more." Ethan stared at the envelope, then back at Emily. "I can't take your money. We don't even know each other. You served our country," Emily said gently. "My dad always said we owe veterans more than we can ever repay. Take it. Keep your family and your home." Ethan shook his head. "That's your money. You must need it for something important." Emily hesitated. She did need it desperately, but the thought of Ethan's family being thrown out of their home, with a sick child, was worse than what she was facing. "I'll figure something out," she said softly. "Maybe I can sell another horse." Maggie watched from behind the counter, concern etched on her face. "Emily, are you sure about this? What about your ranch?" Emily pushed the envelope closer to Ethan. "Take it. Please." Ethan's eyes welled with tears. His hand trembled as he reached for the envelope. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Emily replied softly. Just promise you'll get back on your feet. I swear I'll pay you back, Ethan said firmly, his voice filled with gratitude. Every penny. Emily smiled. No rush. Take care of your family first. Ethan stood, wincing slightly as he put weight on his bad leg. He extended his hand. Ethan Harris. Emily West, she replied, shaking his hand. Where can I find you when I can pay you back? At Miller Ranch, about 10 miles east of town. Can't miss it, small place with a red barn, Ethan said, carefully tucking the envelope into his jacket pocket. Thank you, Emily. I won't forget this, he said softly. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Emily West woke up with a strange feeling in her heart. She felt an odd sense of relief, even though her situation hadn't changed. But when she thought about Ethan and his family, her heart was filled with a new kind of energy, a hope she hadn't felt so clearly before. Emily couldn't remember the last time she had felt at ease, but as she got out of bed, the feeling of making the right choice lingered in her mind. Despite the difficulties, she knew she had done the right thing. The horses would have to wait, but Ethan's family, especially his sick child, needed her more at that moment. She sat down at the breakfast table, the bills still left unresolved, but she no longer felt the weight of them as she had before. I'll figure something out, Emily whispered to herself. She got dressed, put on her shoes, and went outside. The morning air was a little chilly, but it didn't bother her. She decided to visit Miller Ranch, the one Ethan had mentioned. Perhaps there was no other way to help him than to see his situation for herself. Miller Ranch? The scenery along the road to Miller Ranch was familiar, with vast fields surrounding the area and distant mountains partially veiled in the morning mist. Emily drove past the parched fields, each road leading her to a different world, one where her struggles were no longer the center of everything but a part of a larger story. When she arrived, she felt the stark contrast between her ranch and Ethan's. Miller Ranch wasn't very large, but it had a warm, welcoming feel. A small wooden house with a red roof and a yard overgrown with wild grass. She parked the truck and got out, taking in the fresh air, even though it carried the quiet of a place that hadn't been well taken care of. She stood at the doorstep, hesitant, but then decided to knock. A moment later, the door opened, and Ethan stood before her. He wore his old jacket, but there was a strength about him, despite the exhaustion in his face. Emily, you came? Ethan said, surprised. I came to visit you and your family. Emily smiled softly. I hope I'm not interrupting. Ethan shook his head. You're not interrupting at all. Come in. Emily stepped inside, and the atmosphere in the house was heavy with a sense of weariness. A worn armchair sat next to a small fireplace, casting a faint warmth. On the wooden table, some medical supplies were scattered haphazardly. Emily realized this was where Ethan's family faced many difficulties, illnesses in their children and the inability to keep up with life. This is my wife, Sarah. Ethan motioned to the woman sitting in a chair by the window. Sarah looked tired, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. But when she saw Emily, she smiled faintly, even though it seemed like she didn't have the energy to speak much. Hi, Emily, Sarah said weakly, but with heartfelt gratitude. Emily smiled and walked over, taking Sarah's hand. Hi, I'm really glad to meet you. Ethan pulled a chair for Emily, and they began talking about life, about the hardships his family was facing. Ethan shared the difficult days after coming back from the war, the wounds not only on his body but also in his soul. He also talked about their dire financial situation, being unable to pay the rent, and their young son, Tommy, who was gravely ill due to lack of medical care. You really need help, Emily said seriously, her eyes never leaving Ethan's. We know, Ethan sighed. But we don't want to bother anyone. Emily looked into his tired eyes, and in that moment, she understood why he had rejected help in the past. Ethan was a soldier, and accepting help felt like a failure to him. You've done so much for me when I needed it, Emily said gently. So I'm just doing what I can do for you and your family. We can't. Ethan started, but Emily interrupted. You won't have to pay me back right away, but I hope you'll trust me.